Bills, bills, bills. You got your telephone bills. You got your automobiles. You've got your... Yeah, you've got your weekly egg bill. I don't think Destiny's Child mentioned that one back in 1999. But the point is, rising bills are the soundtrack to all our lives. And most economists expected them to jump further because of US President Donald Trump's trade war. But so far, the anticipated jump in consumer prices hasn't happened. So what is happening with prices? Are the predictions wrong or just too early? Let's try and find out. It's what we do here on Reuters Econ World. Every week, we pick a phrase or buzzword and go deep on the economic principles and ideas driving the biggest news around the world. So this week, prices. I'm your host, Carmel Crimmins, in Dublin. Most economists believe that tariffs raise prices for consumers and businesses. That's because tariffs are a tax on imported goods. They raise the price of that imported good, and that higher cost is usually passed on to consumers through increased prices. And we all know that President Trump has been busy hiking tariffs.
My fellow Americans, this is Liberation Day. Waiting for a long time.
But so far, the rate of inflation, that's the technical term for rising prices, is defying economists' predictions. So what is going on? To find out, I spoke to Dan Burns, Reuters' US economics editor and a regular guest on the show. Hey Dan, how's it going?
Great, Carmel, how are you?
I'm good.
Greetings from beautiful Buffalo, New York.
Oh, fantastic. Is the sun shining?
The sun is shining. It's beautifully temperate. I'm back in my home stomping grounds for a little bit of a family visit.
Oh, nice. So Dan, I'm going to pull you away from your family for a moment to go deep on prices and inflation. Can we go, just to put off our listeners right from the get-go, can we go straight into the nerdy stuff and get under the bonnet of how the US actually calculates inflation?
All right. Well, there's a couple of key measures, and the one that is probably best known is the Consumer Price Index.
Yeah.
It's an index that measures the change in cost of goods that consumers pay for directly, goods and services that consumers pay for directly.
Yeah.
And the Labor Department actually sends out a few hundred actual price checkers around the country every month to look at things on store shelves and to check on the price and changes in price and services. And that's something that has been going on for decades. The actual process has gotten some additional attention in the last couple of weeks because of budget cuts and staffing cuts by the new Trump administration. The Labor Department, like most other agencies across the government, has been under a hiring freeze, and there's been some indications of some job cuts there. And that's affected the ability to collect all of that data. The Labor Department said in the last week or two that, in fact, some of the collection efforts in some cities around the country, including Buffalo, where I am right now, are for the moment curtailed and are having to be relied upon by estimates. That's given some cause of concern among economists, but nobody is saying that it's been a fatal blow to the quality of the data so far. But it's something that does bear watching over the course of the months ahead.
Got it. So that's the Consumer Price Index.
Right.
But then there's the personal consumption expenditures, the PCE.
Consumptions, and and that comes from the Commerce Department, and that's an alternate measure of inflation, and it covers a wider range of costs. Maybe not to the specificity. I mean, CPI has hundreds of different line item categories. Everything from children's footwear to audio equipment. It's not exactly that granular in PCE, but it does capture other areas of expenditure and cost changes. So CPI is everything that a consumer buys for themselves directly, right?
Right.
But there are things that we consume that are partially provided for us indirectly. Think about health insurance and the cost for that, which is shared typically by your employer.
Right.
And brokerage services and other things so those are things that are not captured in CPI that are captured in PCE. And that, for instance, is why, the Federal Reserve, which I know we're going to be talking about, prefers the PCE over CPI as its preferred measure for inflation.
Now, for both measures, there's core and non-core, right? Can you explain to the listeners what core PCE might be or core CPI?
So in that, and they're both generally on, singing from the same hymnal. It's, it excludes what we in our copy always say, volatile food and energy prices.
Yeah.
And it is true. Food and energy prices have a tendency to swing, as we're seeing right now with the tensions in the Middle East and oil prices surging right now by 9, close to double-digit percentages.
Yeah.
And then other things like avian flu can make the cost of eggs, spike. Yeah, they did earlier this year, 20, 30, 40%.
Right.
For a period. So they tend to be a basket of consumption that has a sensitivity to unexpected events and seasonality and other things that they like to remove to get a better sense of, in the core basket, of the underlying trend of inflation.
Yeah.
Now, but remember, the Fed, it confuses people because the Fed has an inflation target. It would like inflation to be around 2% as measured by the annual change in overall PCE, right?
Right.
But it also tracks core PCE as its preferred measure for how inflation is really behaving, right?
Right.
So there's a fine distinction there. But that's why there's often a lot of confusion. And some people think that, core PCE is what the Fed sets its target by, but that's not the case. It's a guidepost toward achieving the target, which is set by headline PCE. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So the Fed does care about the price of eggs and the price of oil.
Absolutely. It wants to make sure that inflation overall, the overall cost experience of American households is something close to 2%.
Yeah.
On an annual increase based.
Now, we were expecting that tariffs would raise consumer prices, but inflation data out so far this year has been more muted than expected, right?
Yes, it is. Yeah, both by CPI and PCE measures. Inflation is not really all that far off the Fed's target. The most recent measures of headline CPI, 2.4% year over year. At the core rate, it was 2.8. Those were measures for May. And on PCE, which we have not yet gotten for May, so this is an April number, where the headline was 2.1, so very close to the Fed's target, and core was 2.5. You're right. There has been so far very limited pass-through effects visible in the inflation data. It doesn't mean it's not there at all, and that a lot of economists still believe that those price effects are going to begin materializing and asserting themselves over the course of the months ahead, over the summer and into the fall. But there's a big debate about whether that's going to be, something that's ongoing or something that's a little bit of a one-time price level reset and things level off from an inflation perspective after that. Those are the big unknowns.
So what is the data telling us, Dan? Like, what are the numbers showing?
So there is some evidence of some cost increases from tariffs, but those are being offset by, up to now, we've seen a very substantial drop in energy prices this year. Gasoline prices, are low for a standard time of year where we often see in the run up to summer, we often see an increase in gasoline prices. It's not been the case this year.
Yeah.
That's a pretty big weight, both in CPI and PCE. So that's been a damper. We've seen things like shelter costs, which had been an aggravant for inflation for much of the last couple of years, during which the Fed's been trying to bring them down through higher interest rates.
Yeah.
Shelter costs have been one of those things that have kept them elevated. But, we're seeing year-over-year shelter costs are now their lowest in several years. So that's those are moderating forces. So those are kind of key things are offsetting the early effects we're starting to see in core goods, which are starting to tick up. Things like home appliances are year over year.
Yeah.
In last month, we're up by the most since August 2020.
Okay.
On a monthly basis, they were actually up the most ever.
Okay.
Motor vehicle parts up pretty substantially, recreational goods, things like audio equipment, household furnishings. So a handful of things we're showing that are affected by tariff pricing were higher, not in necessarily enormously so, but they, notably breaking with a trend where they had all been kind of easing over the last year. And in the last month or two, they've flipped up.
Got it.
So we're looking for that. And, but really big ticket things, people are saying, wow, people talked about all the front running of cars and there's 25% auto tariffs.
Yeah.
And Trump is now talking about maybe doubling that. Why aren't we seeing that? And there was enormous front running of purchases in March and April at U.S. auto dealerships.
Right.
But even that, it didn't completely clear out their inventory. And then we saw a big give back in that sales rate in May. The seasonally adjusted annual rate of sales of motor vehicle sales dropped in May by the most, since the pandemic. So there wasn't a big need to try to push through price increases in a moment where you'd seen a big weakening in demand because of the big increase in demand the previous 2 months. But those prices that we are seeing in things like motor vehicle parts may translate in the not too distant future into price increases for vehicles. And other things, airline fares were down significantly, right? There's been a lot of uncertainty around the travel outlook over this coming summer. So that's also something that is, acting as a counterweight to some of these core goods increases.
Got it. So we're seeing some of the cracks appearing and we're waiting to see if it becomes more broad-based. But, you mentioned the airline prices there, that the demand is kind of weak. Companies may be put off putting up prices. Like they may actually swallow some of the tariff costs themselves, right?
That's a dynamic that we're expecting, that we've seen to some degree.
Right.
There does seem to be a willingness at this point for companies to trade margin for market share.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
But there's a limit to how far they're willing to take that and not begin to push through the price increases. Walmart, the largest physical retailer still in the United States, has said it had held off raising prices, but began doing it in a measured way beginning in May.
Right.
Others not rushing to join suit. In a more niche space. I mean, it's big. Home Depot, they are at the moment choosing not to pass through cost increases that are coming, and we've seen, that tool prices, things like that are up, and there's lumber tariffs coming. So we'll see how well, a company like that is able to hold to that guidance in the months ahead.
As Dan mentioned, one consumer price that has soared in the last year is eggs. The average price of a dozen eggs in the US has been on a roller coaster since the COVID-19 pandemic. Back then, supply chain disruptions sent their price spiking. That's when my pod colleague, Christopher Walljasper, got his first backyard chickens.
We've got 10 chickens, and they're various breeds. We got our first 4 right at the beginning of the COVID lockdown. Partly out of a worry about empty grocery stores, but also kind of out of boredom. And it became a real learning opportunity for not only us, but also our kids. The kids now help feed and collect eggs and take care of them. All right, go get eggs.
Okay, Dad.
How many we got today?
Let me count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 eggs.
Nice. What color? That's my daughter Bernadette. She's 8.
Chris's chickens lay about an egg a day, and he's pretty happy with the investment. Because even though egg prices calmed down after COVID, they soared again after an outbreak of avian flu forced farmers to kill millions of chickens. A few months ago, a dozen eggs cost more than $6. And while the average price has dropped to around $4.50, that's still a chunk of change, particularly for a product that's meant to have what economists call inelastic demand. That means consumers will keep buying it even if supply goes down and prices go up.
It takes quite a bit of work to check on them, keep them fed and watered, but even with the cost of feed, the price of our eggs per dozen is well below what you get at the grocery store. And there's an added bonus that they're fresh. So all in all, we're pretty happy with the investment we made 5 years ago that's still going strong. All right, see you later, chickens.
So Dan, the expectation is that more price increases are on their way.
That's the expectation, though a lot of economists really had expected to start seeing more evidence of it now. It's strengthened the Trump administration's arguments that the tariffs, in their view, will not be inflationary. And in fact, it's tempered some prominent economists' views that of just how much it will translate into inflation. For instance, Goldman Sachs in recent days has said they expect a more moderate pass-through to inflation from tariffs than they'd previously modeled. And as a result, they're also lowering their risks of recession as a result. They knocked it down by 5 percentage points from a 35% probability to a 30% in just the last few days as part of that narrative.
So are we seeing economists recalibrate their estimates for where inflation is going to end up at the end of the year? Are they taking that figure down?
Some are. We haven't seen it reflected in broad consensus estimates yet, but certainly some individual economists are expecting a more moderate pass-through to prices and year-end kind of inflation rate. Most of them are not too far off where Fed officials estimate it will be. And, that's with the headline PCE of around 2.7% by the end of the year, give or take a little bit, a core rate of about 2.8%. But those are numbers that right now are up from the set of data that I recited at the top of the show, right?
Yeah.
So that's on a core basis, not so much, but the headline basis is. We'll see, certainly.
For listeners, where should they expect? Can we sort of say where we're expecting to see price increases, and when will that happen? Is it going to be over the summer? And do we know? Could we make an educated guess as to which category? Should people be stocking up on hammers and nails and flip-flops?
Well, those are the things that are affected by both the across-the-board reciprocal tariffs and also some of the secular tariffs that have added. It's this phenomenon called stacking. Right. So just to use China as an example, the Trump administration says, after the back and forth and negotiations, 2 rounds of negotiations they've had with China, they've settled at a 55% tariff rate for imported goods from China. But that's actually a result of a 10% reciprocal across the board universal tariff that they've imposed essentially on all trading partners, under the Liberation Day tariff regime. That's a 20% additional tariff that China, along with Mexico and Canada, are paying because of the Trump administration's assertion that the three are culpable in allowing fentanyl to flow into the United States. So it's a punitive measure taken against those three specifically for that. So then we get to 30%. And then you've got 25% tariffs that had already existed from Trump's first term. So that's where you get the 55%. Now, on top of that, in some goods categories, you've got sectoral tariffs on things like imported steel and aluminum. And it's not just on imported raw steel and aluminum, it's on some of the derivative products. And they've been expanding that list of derivative products to things like nails and laundry equipment.
Right.
So it doesn't necessarily mean there's a straight pass through 25% to your next clothes dryer purchase, but some portion of the metal content in that big box is going to be tagged with a 25% price increase that will add overall to that. So if that's a washer and dryer that comes from China, that 55% goes up yet a little bit more.
But having said all that, at the moment, things look more benign than economists had been expecting. It does make the Fed's job a little bit more difficult when it says it's pausing. People might ask, why aren't you just cutting rates? Inflation is fine.
That's the debate currently ongoing. And the question is, are you in a camp that really believes the price increase is coming, in which case acting now to lower rates would be something that you'd only have to reverse later and would be viewed as having made a policy mistake? Or do you believe that it's going to be demand destroying and by extension something that weakens the economy overall and leads to a rise in the unemployment rate, in which case that you would argue will act sooner than later to buffer against that? Or do you just not know? And in the case of not knowing, where you are is not a bad place to be.
A big thank you to Dan and everyone who covers economics at Reuters. You can catch their work on Reuters.com and the Reuters app. If you're interested in understanding more about markets and the economy, check out Reuters Open Interest, a new source for global financial commentary. You can catch that too on Reuters.com and the Reuters app. Sound design, music composition, and engineering on this episode was by Alex Summer. Our podcast team includes Kim Vanell, Tara Oakes, Josh Summer, Gail Issa, Christopher Wall-Jasper, Jonah Green, David Spencer, and Sharon Reich Garson. Our executive producer is Leela de Kretzer. Remember, for all your daily news, check out our weekday show, Reuters World News. You can catch it on the Reuters app or wherever you listen to your podcasts.